And I think we're live. Good
Cool.
afternoon, everyone. My name is Katya Berthold, and I will be your moderator today. I am super excited to introduce our guest for this event. But first, I'd like to take this opportunity to highlight one of our silver sponsors, the Illinois Growth and Innovation Fund, in partnership with the Illinois State Treasurer. The Illinois Growth and Innovation Fund is an evergreen $1 billion impact investment fund that will invest in ways to attract, assist, and retain quality technology enabled businesses in Illinois. They do this by making targeted investments with venture capital, growth equity, and private venture debt firms. Just one second. Sorry, Charles. I'm gonna mute you just because there's just a small echo. And then we can head back over. So, like I was saying, they do this by making targeted investments with venture capital, growth equity, and private venture debt firms with a nexus to the state of Illinois. And they also aim to invest more than $1 billion on a continuing and recurring basis, creating an estimated 60,000 jobs per investment cycle. ILGIF, which is their acronym, has been at the forefront of increasing equity, diversity, and inclusion within the venture capital ecosystem, with 40% of its committed capital invested with venture capital firms led by women and people of color. If you want to learn more, you can visit www.ilgif.com. And now back to the event. I am joined today by the one and only Charles Adler, the co founder of Kickstarter. Charles has over 20 years of building products, companies, and teams in technology from Fortune 500 firms all the way to startups. His career began as an individual team contributor, evolved to design leader responsible for world changing products and the teams who built them, to most recently, advisor to startups and Fortune 100 companies alike. One of his most recent projects is Lost Arts, which he'll talk a little bit more about today, and it's an online platform for freeform creative work. The other thing I want to say is that today's chat is designed to be very conversational. So, as interactive as we can be on a virtual platform, we're encouraging you to drop your reactions, your questions, your comments in the chat on the main stage item on the right hand side. So, be sure to do that. And then, I guess without further ado, Charles, I'll hand it off to you.
Thank you, Katya. Thanks everybody for having me, whatever that means these days. So I want to talk a little bit about side projects today. It's a little bit of a different talk for me. I mean, usually I'm digging into the depths of Kickstarter, or talking about the history of Kickstarter. We'll touch on Kickstarter briefly, but I've really been passionate my whole life, and maybe even more importantly, through Kickstarter, about side projects and the different values that they can provide. So this is a little bit of the story, my journey to Kickstarter through side projects. So let's go to the next slide. The next slide. One more. Awesome. So that is me, me in the middle, with my sister, who looks almost identical to me, oddly. What I wanted to share just is, growing up, I was not thinking about entrepreneurship. Tech was barely a thing. Tech meant something very, very different back in the 80s when I was a kid, hence this photograph. And maybe most importantly, I wasn't a kid who grew up thinking, I was going to start a company. There was no lemonade stand that I was, patroning. And so the way I think about this journey for me is almost 100% accidental, but inspired by all these little things that I've done on the side. So a little bit more about me. We'll go to the next slide, just to kind of set the stage a little bit. As a kid growing up, I grew up in Connecticut, and in those days, the hot thing was, at least maybe for me, was skateboarding, what they called alternative music. I haven't heard that term in a long time, alternative music. Became really fascinated with what I would now call fringe communities. So skateboarding, graffiti, hip hop, punk rock, electronic dance music, and then ultimately like video games and computers. These were kind of like trying to get into the mainstream, but it was a bunch of people that were effectively tinkering with actually early technologies. If you think about hip hop and electronic dance music, these are people that were playing with electronic music instruments that hadn't found the mainstream yet. I was fascinated by all of this, and maybe the ultimate connection for me was, if we go to the next slide, just this expression of creativity. And when I say expression of creativity, it was against the odds of success. And so what I've been fascinated with, kind of represented by this cute little Lego animation, is the story of Sisyphus. The story of Sisyphus is this person, this Greek story of Sisyphus who's pushing a rock up a hill for it to forever in infinitum fall back down, right? And to me, that is kind of the creative journey. It's self-rewarding, it's brutal, the rock can be very big, the hill slope can be very tall, and so it's not an easy journey, but for some reason these people do this thing, right? And that's always fascinated me. And so that's a little bit maybe of an introduction to who I am, and I think the important part to that, kind of ego aside, frankly, is it explains a little bit about the things that I've been involved in or have involved myself with. So let's talk about the first side project, and I'll set the stage a little bit. So this is a project called Subsistence. It's a misspelling of subsistence. But basically, this was a project that I started in about, I think it was like 1996, 1997. I had just dropped out of university. I studied mechanical engineering at Purdue. So now I've moved from the East Coast into the Midwest. And I just moved up to Chicago. And so if I unpack a little bit of a layer, another layer about, I guess my experience at school and things that were fascinating to me, university was an amazing time, right? So there's the community of people that I was hanging around with that were artists, predominantly musicians, and another group of people that were kind of in, I'll call it technology. Those were my colleagues who were studying mechanical engineering, but there was a bunch of friends that were also studying computer science or just interested in computers. I was also interested in computers. And along came, while I was at university, this fascinating technology called the internet. And I say it in that way because this was like 1992, 1993. And this was just as the internet was becoming public. And then a few years later, just as the web was becoming an experiment. Right, so Mosaic had launched, which became Netscape, blah, blah, blah. I won't go into too much detail about that, but Subsistence was kind of a merging of all of these things for me. And if I think about my time in engineering school, where we were studying about manufacturing and supply chain and materials and all this amazing stuff, and then the formulas and blah, 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 it was really exciting, but really slow. And what fascinated me about the combination of the arts or design, software, being able to program, and then the internet that brings people together around the thing that you built is the immediacy and the iteration that you can, or the speed at which you can work through these iterations was so much faster. So I could have an idea, I could design it, I could build it, I could put it out there, see how people were using it, and then change it. So Subsistence came out of that. That was basically motivated by my love of music. So at the same time, I was also a DJ. I had friends who were DJs. As most of us, we didn't have access to a nightclub. We weren't part of the scene per se. And so I felt that was very unfortunate. And so I put together this website, very simple, again, 1996 or so, to give us a venue, effectively almost like a virtual nightclub, and we would stream our DJ sets once a week. Totally innocent, no interest in making money. It was just a way to hang out and meet more friends at this time in Chicago. a light bulb went off for me, which was as you start looking at the traffic logs of who was listening, where they were from, you start realizing there's people in London, there's people in somehow China, there was people in Hong Kong, there was people in Korea and the Czech Republic and Russia, as well as down the street that were listening in, right? And so there's this weird kind of eureka moment that we were giving these people in Chicago an audience that was not just in Chicago. It was a different kind of audience, it was a different kind of nightclub. That fascinated me. A couple of years later, I had shut the project down. A couple of years later, I resuscitated it with a friend who was one of the DJs that I had invited in. And we kind of evolved the project to be much more embracing to other art forms. So photography, what we now call like interactive art. At the time, it was a bunch of stuff that a couple of artists were doing in Flash, if anybody remembers Flash. I think Flash just got shut down recently. And so that was a moment where we were starting to expand our sort of the tapestry of the stuff that we would curate and showcase, and it turned into a project that was much more like a magazine online than a streaming service. We stopped the streaming stuff. So we'll go to the next slide. And I'm a big fan of time and time off. And so there was this, what I'll call like negative space or white space in between. So the second version of Subsistence, we ended up shutting it down because I had moved to New York and my collaborator had gone to grad school. So we couldn't work on it anymore. And there was no money to it. We weren't making any money. We kind of elegantly shut it down. It was kind of a sad moment, but it kind of ran its course for us in some capacity. That white space was really important because it gave me some time to step away and not think about Subsistence. And then from time to time, think about like how special that project was and how informative that project was. So we'll move away from white space and move to the next slide. Dun, dun, dun. Kickstarter. So there's two scenes here. One was literally Kickstarter in 2009 when we launched. Looks very different than the image on the right, which is Kickstarter literally last night. Screenshot of Kickstarter recently. And that's just to show that these projects evolve, right? We're constantly looking at and tweaking these projects. But the important piece is, frankly, I never would have been a part of Kickstarter if I hadn't done Subsistence. And frankly, if I had even been introduced to Perry, who was my co-founder, I never would have understood what he was after if I hadn't done Subsistence. Subsistence informed so much about this project, Kickstarter. There's probably a whole case study that I can put together in terms of like all of the learnings that we got to funnel into Kickstarter. I'll take one little quick deviation from this and just say that the other important thing to note is I had a job throughout the years of Subsistence. I was working as a what's called an information architect or a designer, product designer. And those years were critically important too, because it gave me training in terms of how to think about business, how to think about my approach to work as a lead-in to Kickstarter. And so there was this equilibrium of information that I was getting both from Subsistence, totally free-spirited project, no intention to make money, totally self-funded because of this day job that I had, plus the learnings from the day job that got to funnel into Kickstarter. I would have to imagine that a lot of that led to the success that Kickstarter has today. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so this is kind of a little conclusion, but also speaks to maybe a different way to think about what we call side projects. So I left Kickstarter at the end of 2013 with no real plan, right? I had a small runway of cash saved up to live off with my family, and a couple of ideas that I knew I wanted to tackle, but I knew I needed to explore them in a more innocent kind of way, let them kind of be R&D, so to speak. Maybe not even R&D, because that sounds almost a little bit too professional. But so one of those projects was what has become Lost Arts, which started out as a physical space. And so what I had done in Chicago in two different spaces, one as a 1 month little pop-up and the other as a 1 year pop-up, was experimented with what it meant to bring different people from different disciplines together around literal tools, 3D printers, laser cutters, table saws, hand tools, sewing machines, you name it. What it looked like to bring these people together, and would they actually learn from one another? Is there value to these folks being around each other? This is very much influenced by my early love of things like the Bauhaus. Hopefully everybody at IIT knows about the Bauhaus. If you don't, shame on IIT, but look up the Bauhaus. And so what was interesting is it was working, but not as well as I would have liked. And so what happened is I took another moment of white space. I took about 1.5 years after running that second version of Lost Arts to kind of step away from the project and think through what were the things that were happening, what were the motivations of people in the space, what were some of the values of this community, and how else can I think about this potential business or this project. And so the image on the right is a bad screenshot, but it's an example of this where we're going, which is actually bringing a global community of creatives together that are working through those early stages of a project. You can think about it as feedback, you can think about it as critique, you can think about it as a community that's going to share resources in some way. And so it's back to its infancy. It's now back as a side project. And once again, I have a day job. I'm happy to be sitting in our office right now, that is allowing me to fund Lost Arts very, very early kind of incubation. It's kind of starting over again. So you could almost think about, or I almost think about Lost Arts, the first version as a side project, completely self-funded. The second version was trying to be a little bit more professional. Got some angel investors from around Chicago and elsewhere to help build that space that you see in the image on the left. And then back to side project, where I'm self-funding it, building it with a developer, and then maybe we'll get to another stage, as I was talking to Katya before, fingers crossed. So I think the conclusion here, if we go to the last slide, I guess it's fine. The conclusion is the beauty of side projects, and I very viscerally felt this once I took this job and intentionally made Lost Arts a side project, is it released all the tension to perform in a certain way that gave me the freedom to actually think, hopefully unbiased from economics, of what's it gonna take to get this Lost Arts product, the app, to provide value to people, right? To empower these creative people around the world to further their project along. And so again, I'm at the very beginning stages of that, but the feeling of doing that now that the economic pressure is off is actually pretty incredible. Maybe we do another one of these in a couple of months and I can report on the progress, because I'm just now starting that process. But I think that's it. That's all I really wanted to share, just this idea that side projects are super valuable, and perhaps particularly as students who are coming out of school and you're gonna get this professional job, I think it's really important to keep your own vitality, keep your own independence, and keep that, what I believe is a critical creative curiosity. Where can you take the things that you've learned or are learning along the way?
Thank you so much, Charles. That was awesome. And like I said earlier, we want this to really be a dialogue. So if you guys have thoughts, if you have questions, now's the time to ask. I actually did have a question, Charles. Going back to that other slide you had about the time between, can you expand a little bit more about that and why that's so important to you?
Yeah. It's funny. So I'll answer the question with an analogous story. I'm in California, and I'm here for a company retreat. So executive staff is out here. We went out to Yosemite, And there was a moment where I was just sitting like staring at El Capitan. If anyone is familiar with El Capitan, it is crazy. I didn't think about work. It cleared my head, right? And I think there are these moments like that time period where I was frankly like just really focused on moving to New York and appreciating the fact that I was living in New York and experiencing New York and focusing on work. Work became a distraction for me for side projects, right? And I think it just, that period is valuable because you start to look at the other things around you beyond work. Like work is a distraction, you keep busy, that's important. It pays for your ability to live a certain way. But then I start looking in a different way at the artists that I was excited about, the artists that I appreciated and the work that they were doing. And I think it got me to kind of move to whatever the next step was, right? And the next step really didn't happen until I met Perry. And if I can describe that for a minute, if you're familiar with like the elevator pitch, right? You have a few seconds to share what it is very succinctly to what you're doing. This was not that kind of conversation. It was kind of a longer winded story of what Perry was building. And there was a moment where, as he was describing this, it all kind of came into focus about a couple minutes into him describing what Kickstarter, what he wanted Kickstarter to be. And what informed that moment of focus for me was definitely subsistence, but it was also that break, that I think that time period away where I was thinking about all these other creative people in the world that I've been excited about the thing that they're working on, and how difficult that had been for them. These are predominantly people that I knew or people that I knew about their story of bringing something to life. And it wasn't stuck in that period that subsistence was birthed in, right? So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's, I think it gets us away from the rigor of maintaining something.
Yeah, no, that definitely does. I think that one slide, your whole presentation was awesome, but that one slide was really powerful to me personally because knowing my personality, if I go even a couple weeks without working on something, let alone a couple years, I feel like I would feel like I'm wasting my time and I should have been working on something during that time. So knowing that that break is necessary, that time to reset actually might help your next project be more successful is really comforting to hear.
I'll add two things. One is you never know how long that period is going to be. It could be a day, it could be a week, it could be years. Right? For me, it tends to be years. I don't know. Maybe I'm slow. The other thing I'll say, just props to Katya, for everybody else, is like, frankly, this whole talk was inspired by a conversation that you and I had in preparation for this, right? So just hearing your story about the side projects that you've been doing while at university, like that's pretty incredible. Like if you think about it, your day job was school, but you made time for this other stuff, right? The other way that I look at it is, you're learning certain things at school in the format that your professor or your teacher is providing to you. But these are some like pretty awesome things. Like you pick this school or this profession or this course of study for a reason. Like go use those tools to do some other weird stuff. It doesn't even have to be art. Like it can be art, it could be industrial design. I don't know, do something, build yourself a table, right? And so I think making the time, like making a concerted effort is really, really important. Katya, you've clearly done that. But I think again, to the point, like it's okay not to do that all the time.
Oh, thank you. That's really nice and very honoring to hear. You actually did answer my next question where it was
Uh-oh.
how long do you know is too long or too short? I feel like
Yeah.
that part is a little scary, but
Mm.
yeah, no, I appreciate you saying that, and I think, like you said, what I'm studying, it's not everything I want to do, but I've definitely grown in my other aspects because of the school that I'm going to, the classes that I'm studying, all that engineering homework has helped me become a better student entrepreneur in a way. So
Can
I like that connection.
can I switch the question that you didn't ask that I pre-answered?
Yes, of
So
course.
a question that I get a lot, and then maybe is also appropriate in lieu of the talk, which was, when do you know when the side project or the venture that you're working on is something that you should like commit to, right? And the answer is kind of the same, as if you don't actually know, but there's like an innateness or a gut or this isn't going to work. Like I've taken this to the limit of in terms of my time management between this full-time thing and this side project. And so there becomes a point, I think, where it feels risky, but there's probably enough work put into, and like there's some proximity to a complete product that it feels right, but it should also feel scary. Like Kickstarter was super scary, but maybe I can also unpack this transition from, I missed one part in there, which was, that in that gap period, I was still working for this company, doing the same thing, kind of growing in my career. And then at one point, I think it was like 2005, that feels wrong, but maybe it was 2005. Let's just say it was 2005. I quit, kind of cold turkey. I had enough. I worked there for a decade and I was fed up. And I had zero plan. I seem to do this a lot, but I had zero plan. But I was going to start. I knew I was going. I had zero preparation, but I knew I was going to start a company. And so I basically started my own product design studio and built that business up. It was doing okay. It was a studio of one, just me, but. There was a transition period as I was making money and doing work for clients. I was also doing Kickstarter, and Kickstarter was starting to take up about 80, 90, 99% of my time. And my client work was kind of getting less and less. And so there was this point where, actually, point over probably a couple of weeks, if not months, that I was debating with my partner, my co-founder. Usually his question was, hey, when are you gonna, like, when can we get more of your time? When are you gonna get rid of this other stuff that you're doing? Because it seems like maybe you're distracted. I was like, I'm not distracted. I'm not distracted. But there was a point where, you just need to make a call. And so, the benefit I had with that is I could kind of create my own day and dictate when I worked on what. So generally it was like midnight to 2 a.m. that I was working on client work, and the rest of the day I was working on Kickstarter stuff. If you have a day job, clearly you don't have that flexibility, although maybe COVID, who knows? But, I think just thinking about the day in a different way is also very important.
Definitely. And I also like how as bad as this pandemic is, it is an opportunity to be creative with how you use your time. And I've seen a lot of people kind of use this as a time to spark those side projects. So
Yeah.
definitely. Unfortunately, yeah, go.
Daniel's got a cool question.
Yes, I was gonna
Okay,
say we have
cool.
time for one last question. Yeah.
Awesome. We're on the same page. So awesome question, Daniel. What would you say is the right balance between taking inspiration from breaks while also focusing on getting work done? I'm going to ask a question back to you, which is, when you say getting work done, is it work on side projects or work for somebody else, like your job? And I'll just keep going until I hear back from you. But I don't know. I think it's all very personal. I mean, I will say that I am jealous or admire other people's balancing act, right? We all kind of balance things differently. And sometimes we have to balance things that don't feel in line with our creative self. So I'll give an example of that. Like, I've got 2 kids, a dog, a wife, and a mortgage, and now a job. And a job that, frankly, I'm responsible for a team in California and a team in Tokyo. And so time zone, we talk about time management. Time management is pretty brutal. So maybe I can talk a little bit about how I'm balancing my work life with my Lost Arts creative side project and my kids, frankly. So the beauty of living in Chicago and working for a company on the West Coast is I get 2 to 3 hours in the morning where, like, nobody else is awake. Now, it does mean that I'm working late at night, so I've got calls till 10 o'clock at night sometimes because of this team in Tokyo. But I'm cool with that, and it's not every single day. But I get this time in the morning, both to have kind of a relaxed morning with the kids. During COVID, they were doing remote school, but I also get time to go for a walk, go for a bike ride, or work on lost arts. And so I realize that I'm very fortunate in being able to construct that, but there's other ways to do that. Get up at 4 in the morning and work on your stuff. And we had an engineer at Kickstarter who, again, I admired the way he worked. I couldn't do this, but he rented a studio in New York. Mind you, New York is crazy expensive. So he rented a studio, and before work, he would get up super early and get to the studio to paint because he needed to paint. And that was the only time that he could paint. And then in the evening, he would spend time with his family and kids. And during the day, he was building Kickstarter. He was a software developer. And so, he's got his own version of time that's right for him. So I think it's just, honestly, like looking inward and thinking about like, where do you get the most energy? My energy generally tends to be in the morning, and I taper off in the afternoon. So I wanted to protect that time in the morning.
Thank you for sharing that, Charles. I've heard that very similar method where morning or night, taking time that's for you. I've learned to be a very common strategy by successful entrepreneurs. So thank you for sharing.
Yeah, and we fail a lot at doing that, mind you, but yeah.
Yeah, speaking of that, after Chicago Startup Week's done, I told myself I'm going to start scheduling more me time. So let's see how that goes. There is one more question, but for the sake of time, Charles, would you mind answering that maybe via chat?
Totally.
And
yeah. You muted yourself.
I totally did. Apologies. Thank you for letting me know.
Yeah.
I just have a couple things to say before we head out. I know we have another event at 1, which I also want to give a shout out to. But first, just want to give Charles another round of applause. Thank you so much for sharing with us. To the audience members, if you liked this event, we would love to hear your feedback on any of your Instagram stories or social media platforms. And if you want, you should tag us at Chicago Startup Week and let us know what you thought so we can reshare platforms. Another thing, we're also doing raffle giveaways. So before we end, we are giving our next raffle prize from the audience. I have randomly picked Emanuela Ben Obo, and you are walking away with a $15 Amazon gift card. Woohoo! Congratulations. We will follow up with you via email with more details. Now, to conclude, for the audience members, I want to encourage you to head over to our next event called Product Demos from Prominent Illinois Natives. It already started 3 minutes ago, so make sure to head over there as quick as you can. In order to get there, you can click on the Sessions tab on your left-hand side. And without further ado, thank you guys so much. I hope you have a great rest of